Greetings and welcome to my podcast, Why So Political? I'm your host, Neha Yadavalli, a high schooler from the United States. Regardless of your views, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Why So Political. This episode covers relatively mature and controversial topics. Audience discretion is advised. The past few years have brought to light the uncanny amount of social injustice that Black people, Indigenous people, Asians, and other minorities in the United States face. When I hear the phrase Black Lives Matter, I'm automatically transformed back to the summer of 2020. There is no way I could ever forget that summer specifically. That was the first time I went to a BLM protest, and as I was marching with friends and family, I distinctly remember a man in a gray truck driving past us with his windows down, and he yelled that we were all fools for marching. Another thing I recall from that time was the All Lives Matter organization, and I'm sure most people, if not all, have heard of it. People who chant All Lives Matter claim that they stand behind the idea that all people can experience racism. Remember that now. I'm going to get back to this. But before I do so, I want to go in depth about All Lives Matter for a minute. Truly, in my eyes at least, the All Lives Matter organization was created solely to diminish and invalidate Black Lives Matter. Globally, Black people are some of the most disenfranchised and oppressed people. And this has been the sad truth for centuries. While no one is denying that all human beings deserve their humanity to be recognized and respected, it's important to bring true awareness to injustices certain groups face. Saying all lives matter is far from helpful when Black people and other minorities are living their day-to-day lives in fear and oppression. Now, let's rewind to what many All Lives Matter advocates believe. They feel that all people can experience racism. But is that really the case in the United States? If all people can experience racism, then why are certain races targeted much more than others? I know questioning a statement like this is extremely controversial, but it's a very valid question. In the United States, can all people experience racism? Now that's the hot topic. Racism is defined as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against a person on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. With this definition, one would think it would be pretty logical to say that every race can be subject to racism. Again, this would be a conclusion based on this literal meaning. And I would agree, all races can experience racism. You can be prejudiced against every race. You can treat people in a certain negative way because of their race, which, by the way, if you do treat someone differently because of their race, you're a bad person. That is not up for debate. When I hear the word racism, I focus mainly on the last part of the word, ism. Ism is a suffix that means a distinctive practice, system, or philosophy, typically a political ideology or an artistic movement. I also think of systemic racism. Systemic racism is defined as a term that refers to a form of racism that is embedded in the laws and regulations of a society or an organization. It manifests as discrimination in areas such as criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, educational, and political representation as well. And while there are unfortunately many deniers of systemic racism, there is overwhelming evidence that would suggest otherwise. Let's take a look at healthcare. According to untiljustice.org, Black Americans are 2 to 3 times more likely to die during childbirth and 2 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than white Americans. We can also see this in terms of education. The average non-white school district receives $2,226 less per student, and the persisting achievement gap means Black students are less likely to attend college, thus reducing their lifetime earnings by a number close to 65%. This is also very relevant in terms of justice and safety. Black Americans are more likely to be stopped by the police, detained pre-trial, charged with more serious crimes, sentenced more harshly than white people, and 2 times more likely to be killed by police. We can also look at this in terms of new beginnings, if you will. Black families are more likely to live near concentrated poverty because of long-term segregation and racist housing and mortgage policies. A Black family earning $157,000 per year is less likely to qualify for a loan than a white family earning around $40,000. And the sad thing is that there are so many more examples of injustices that stem from systemic racism that I could go into. But I think that these are enough to get the point across that systemic racism is definitely a very prevalent issue. But how did systemic racism come to be? Systemic racism is deep-rooted. It goes back centuries. It goes back to when slavery was legal. It goes back to segregation. Heck, it can even be traced back to 15th century Europe, during the colonization of the Americas and transatlantic slave trade. And all of these centuries later, Black people still see the effects of racism. So we could go back to our question, can white people experience racism? And I would say that systemic racism does not apply to white people. White men have created systemic racism in the United States. Thus, a system created by white people does not negatively impact white people. Keep in mind, this system also was created seemingly for white people. So because of this, I would say no, white people cannot experience systemic racism in the United States. Another thing to consider would be retribution. The idea of retribution also plays a pretty significant part in the whole "can you be racist to white people" argument. Retribution is defined as punishment inflicted on someone as vengeance for a wrong or criminal act. Before I go any further, I want to make it extremely clear that I am against retribution and racism as a whole, and I am a firm believer that hatred against someone or a group of people for something out of their control or something that their ancestors did is incredibly detrimental to an enlightened society. But many people make that argument that discrimination or prejudice against white people can be written off as retribution rather than racism. I won't delve into this too much because it really is not my place to determine whether discrimination or prejudice against white people is retribution or racism, but it definitely is some interesting food for thought. So, what is my take on this? In the United States, white people cannot experience systemic racism. But that is not to say that white people cannot be discriminated against. Discrimination towards white people, however, is not as prevalent as racism towards Black people, Indigenous people, and other disenfranchised groups. There is a quote that I heard, although I'm not too sure who said it, but it goes a little something like this. Racism is so American that when protesting it, certain people feel as if you are protesting America. That concludes this episode of Why So Political. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to my take. I know this episode was heavy and controversial, but I truly appreciate your time. If you like what you heard, I highly encourage you to come back next week. A new episode drops every Monday at 8. Have a good one.